Hello everybody and welcome to this first of our new series of talks, Saints Live. I'm Katie Eagleton, I'm the Director of Museums at the University of St Andrews. I might have met some of you, perhaps not all of you, but I'm really glad to be kicking off this series with a talk about the past, present and future of the museums. I joined the university last year in July, so I'm still fairly new in St Andrews terms. But it's a really extraordinary place and I'm really delighted to be here. So I'll give you a little peek in what we're doing and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you could start the slides, please. So the museums at St Andrews have potentially a longer history than you might imagine. And it really goes back along with the university. This is a historic university. It's got an extraordinary 600-year history. And if we can have the next slide, please, it's got some really important and spectacular objects that relate to that history. So almost as soon as the university was established, it created objects like these amazing maces to mark itself and to create its sense of identity. So the three 15th century maces are still a really important part of life in the university today. They are used for graduations. Any of you who've graduated from the university have probably processed behind them. And they only fairly recently started to be thought of as museum objects, but they do really tell something of the spirit and the history of this university. The next slide, please, is an object which you might or might not recognise, but it's one that I think is really important because it says something about how St Andrews has had a much more global history to its collections and its museums than people maybe realise. Because there's been a collection here in the university library for about 300 years or so, perhaps a little more. And we know from the 18th century that travellers and tourists who came to St Andrews reported seeing objects in the library. They came to see the collection of curiosities. And we have records of what was given to the collection in the 18th century. This is a really extraordinary basket, which comes probably from the Hudson's Bay area of Canada. And it was given to the university in either 1728 or 1738. And it already shows the global connections of St Andrews. We don't know much about where this came from specifically. We know it was probably from Algonquin peoples, probably Cree, but we don't know how it came from there to us today. It's a really important object that we're going to be putting on display in the new Wardlaw Museum. So it really marks that 300-year history of collections in the museum and in the university. And the former director of museums, Helen Rawson, wrote a PhD which went into a lot of this documentation in detail. So if you're looking for lockdown reading, it's available online and it's really interesting stuff that relates to that early period of our history. But what happens then in the 19th century is there's the foundation of the Literary and Philosophical Society. And that started in 1838 as a partnership between the town and the university. And one of their really explicit aims was to start a university museum. The library curiosities, including that basket, were transferred to the society. But what then happened was the society worked through all of their networks all over the world to create a new collection. And if we can have the next slide, please, you can see what that collection started to look like by the end of the 19th century. Now, those of you who know the university will probably recognise Upper College Hall, but I'm not sure it still has a llama in it, or a lion, or in fact all these cases. And most of these objects are now actually in the Bell Pettigrew Museum, which you might have seen in the Butte building. But the displays in the Upper College Hall really grew through the 19th century. There was more and more material acquired. You can see a lot of natural history in this collection picture. There was shells, there was rocks, there was animals, there was birds. There was also archaeological specimens and coins and objects collected from all over the world, because St Andrews at that point was very well connected with the East India Company and with lots of the kind of global networks that connected to Fife and Dundee and Scotland. And we have records from throughout the 19th century that list all of the objects that came in. So where they came in from, who they came in given by or bought from. And we have a student project actually at the moment that's going through all of these lists, finding out how things came to us and where and how they were collected. And from September, we'll have a PhD student joining the team to really look at this period, this 19th century early history of the museum. So there's a lot more to come on that, but it's really exciting to see some of how this collection got put together. And it's also really fun looking in the records to see how quickly it became an important part of life in St Andrews. So it started as this partnership between town and university. And by the 1850s, there was reports that on Saturdays in summer, when it was open to the public, there was 200, 250 people a day coming to visit. And there's a really lovely note from the 1850s where they talk about tradesmen and fishermen starting to become interested in the collection, in the museum, and in natural history. So there's a real sense that this, by the middle of the 19th century, was a public as well as a university space. It was seen as part of this connection between the university and the town. Wasn't all going brilliantly well though, because the Literary and Philosophical Society started to run out of money. So the university had to pay more and more of the costs as time went on. It was already providing the space. And by 1904, the university took the whole collection over again. And that was marked by a formal agreement, which also means we have a complete listing of the entire collection and how it was exhibited in 1904. Which is a really amazing resource. Not many museums have that. And it tells us something about the thinking behind the museum as well as what was in the collection. This picture that you're looking at the moment was taken in 1910, and you can already see part of the problem at this point, which is that it's outgrown its space. And it, according to the written list from 1904, was like spilling down the stairs, and there was a storeroom that was also full. And it was described by the director at that point as, and I quote, mainly a store for preservation rather than exhibition of its contents. So they wanted to make it a more engaging, more of what you'd call a kind of modern museum experience. And there was all sorts of proposals. There was one to actually extend the building that Upper College Hall is in and try and make that fourth side of St Salvator's Quad all museum and make a much bigger museum there. But what ended up happening was in 1911-12, there was the opening of a new extension on the Butte Medical Building to create a purpose-built space for what became known as the Bell Pettigrew Museum. And there's a picture of that on the next slide. And it's named after Elsie Bell Pettigrew, who gave the money and was determined to get the best, so specified the mosaic and the display cases and lots of the other details. And she gave the money, and the name is also in honour of her late husband, Professor James Bell Pettigrew. And you can see the displays at the time had still got a lot of objects in them. This was still a collection that sort of struggled to fit in this space, but it was a double height space. So there's these columns around the top and specimens displayed in cases on the balcony level, as well as in the main lower level of the museum. And it was a really lovely set of displays, very much of its time, but the building became more and more cramped. And by the 1950s, the space was needed for teaching. The top half of the museum, there was a floor put in and it became lab space. The collections, particularly you can see the large mammals in this image, they were transferred to other museums, particularly National Museum Scotland, because there was no storage space. But a lot of the collections were kept in the university and dispersed to different parts of the university. So that's the point at which the Bell Pettigrew Museum became really a zoology museum, which is what it is today. Before that, it was more of a collection of a universal type museum, so containing archaeology and anthropology as well as zoology. So then fast forward another 50 years and to the next slide. In 2008, after many years of work to bring these collections back together again, there was a new museum opened, the Museum of the University of St Andrews. So on the Scores, it's a lovely little building between University House and the School of Philosophy. And it focused mainly on the history of the university and incredibly well received. And in the end, kind of a victim of its own success, because within 10 years, the museum had outgrown its spaces. There wasn't the right kind of visitor experience. There wasn't enough space for the programs we wanted to do. And so those of you who've been to St Andrews or been in touch with us recently will know it's been closed for the last couple of years for a really big capital project. And that is extending the building 50%. It's upgrading the environmental controls and all the other systems in the building. It's creating a new entrance area, which you can see drawn onto this photograph to give you an impression of what the front of the building is looking like. It's going to have a lot of new thinking in the displays, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a moment. But really the aim has been to take the best of the Museum of the University of St Andrews, MUSA, and build on that to make it even better and to open longer hours, to make it possible for more people to visit and to see the collections that we have here, which are pretty extraordinary, and we haven't always been able to display as many of them as we wanted to. So on the next slide, there's a very early architect's impression of the extension, which isn't up to date in some details, but it really gives you a sense, if you look at the extension on the side of the building, just of the scale of this, that it really is 50% more space. And because we'll be open more hours, we think about 40% more hours. It'll be a really big change in the way the museum operates. We've also not just made the building bigger, we've rethought everything inside it. So we've redisplayed the 4 existing galleries, and I'll tell you a bit about that in a moment. We're showing much more of the collections than we were able to before, and we've built in rotations and updates because it's the nature of what a university does, that there's always new knowledge being created and new research being done. So we're working to make sure we can keep updating and changing what's in there to make it a really living, active and dynamic kind of place. The temporary exhibition space in that big side extension will have probably 3 larger and several smaller exhibitions a year, and it can be either used as one big space or it can be subdivided. And we've got really exciting plans currently going out about 3 years for the exhibitions in that space. And what we hope that does as well is encourages people to come back, so that this isn't just a place you come to when you've just joined as a new student, but it really becomes part of the life of the university, and that we want to do programs in the museum spaces that make it a really integrated part of life here. To do those programs, we've got spaces in the building. The learning loft was already there, but we're adding a space we're calling the research studio, which is a little bit more of an experimental space. We want to do all sorts of creative and collaborative things in there, and to work with researchers to do presentations of research to the public, but also potentially research with the public and in public. We're just finalising that at the moment, but the idea is that it's really a space where we make things together and do things together. And that's in the spirit of the whole of what we want to do with the museums. We want to be a museum of the university, but to create all our content and all our programmes with staff and students and alumni and friends of the university. So it's a really big kind of collaborative exercise for us. And this big step change in the museum is marked by the new name. So the Wardlaw Museum, named after Bishop Wardlaw, one of the founders of the university, it's to mark that we're stepping up the ambition for what we want to do, and that this is in some ways a sort of new museum on the same site. Can I have the next slide, please? I haven't got time to go through all the objects that are going to be in there. We have extraordinary collections totaling about 115,000 objects. And of those, 3 parts of the collection are recognised as nationally and internationally significant. And that's the Art and Heritage Collection, the Scientific Instruments Collection, and the Chemistry Collection. I would make a pretty strong argument that the whole collection is of that level of importance, but there's paperwork to do before I persuade the Scottish Government to agree with me. But what we're doing with the new museum is to showcase a much broader range of objects. So yes, we'll have the maces on display. Of course, there'll be a red gown. Those are so important to that sense of what the university is and the identity of this place. But there'll also, and you can see this at the bottom right of your screen, be a telegram from NASA, which was sent to a researcher at St Andrews to say that lunar samples from the Apollo moon missions were on their way to him for analysis. Or at the bottom left, an object I find particularly fascinating. This is a zodiac bowl from Burma, from Myanmar, which was acquired in the early 19th century and is just an exquisite piece of silverware. But we think now, from talking to experts at the British Museum, that it's Thai silver, and it may well be one of the earliest pieces known. And the provenance, the records that we have in the university saying when and how it was acquired, are part of how we can place it as one of the earliest pieces known anywhere. The middle row of objects that you can see there, there's everything from stained glass windows and some of the objects that might be more familiar, to early prototype LEDs that were used for research at St Andrews into new technologies for lighting and for all sorts of related areas. So we're showcasing a lot of different kinds of things, and if you look at our blog and social media, we're doing a lot at the moment to feature objects coming in the museum. There's blogs being written by our team, we've got video pieces, and we're really just introducing people to the collections that we find so amazing. On the next slide, I've got the first of a few images that are sort of design impressions of what this will all look like when it's on display. These were done last year by our designers, Campbell & Co, who are one of the leading Scottish exhibition design companies and museum design companies. And you can see already, for those of you who remember Musa, we've gone for a much more sort of dramatic design feel on the inside. We want people to really feel like the spaces are inspiring and interesting, and that they also draw attention to the objects in the right way. So as you go into the museum, if you turn left, you'll enter this space, which is the first of the galleries, and it's called Scotland's First University. So this is where we really look at the history of the university and think about what's special about it. It's where you'll find the maces, of course, it's where you'll find a red gown, but it's also where you'll find a raisin costume. So we're making the point in here that the distinctive sense of self and identity that St Andrews has isn't just to do with looking back to a 600-year past. It's about looking forwards to the future. It's about innovation and about the kind of student life and traditions that there are here. The next gallery on the next slide is the second gallery, which we're calling Inquiring Minds. And as you walk in to this space, you'll see this amazing bank of microscope slides, which will all be backlit. And that's because this is really about teaching and learning, and particularly about the ways that university helps you to learn to see things differently and to see beyond the kind of obvious or the easily visible. So it's a really rich gallery with lots of different kinds of objects. It's got anatomical drawings, it's got models, it's got butterflies, it's got scientific equipment, it's got books. It's really amazing bit of curatorial work to bring this together, to get people into the sort of spirit of exploration and curiosity that a university education is all about, and to bring out loads of art collections. On the next slide, you can see a few more of those as well. So the sort of round metallic things you can see are a set of resonators, and they're just beautiful in their own right. We have a long-running joke in the museum team that we should make lamps or something that look like these. But we'll be displaying those with audio recordings that help you understand not just what they're like, but also what they sound like, how they were used, and how they help with learning and teaching. On this image, you can also see a little bit of a peek through to the third gallery, which I don't have a very good image of because there's been a lot of work done on that space since these designs were done. And that one's called Reformers and Innovators. And it's really about those moments when an idea changes everything. And the idea might be the Reformation, or it might be the invention of photography, or it might be, I mentioned already, LEDs. So that way that there are moments when something happens in St Andrews that ripples outwards and changes the world, or changes the way people see the world. It's also a really extraordinary space because it's a high vaulted space with a lovely window up high, and it's been painted dark grey. So you walk in and you almost kind of have an intake of breath when you see it, because the work the designers have done have made it just look really stunning. So you go through that space, and then on the next slide there's an image of the fourth of the galleries, which we call Expanding Horizons. And this is where in one gallery space we try and capture the global nature of St Andrews, the connections that St Andrews has to lots of different places in the world. And just because that wasn't ambitious enough thing to try and get into one gallery, we've also tried to get the human world, the natural world, and the universe and space all into one gallery. But the principle here is really that work at St Andrews tries to understand the world and the universe. And also objects have come to St Andrews from all over the place. So whether that's the moon samples, the moon rock samples that I mentioned that came in from NASA, or whether it's objects that came from all over the world that you can see on the right-hand part of this image. So we're bringing that research we've been doing on where the collections came from into the gallery to talk about how people understood the world in the 19th century and the ways that research today takes a different approach and helps us understand the world through engagement, through all sorts of different subjects. You can't see it on this rendering, but as you're looking at this to the left behind where that student group is, and I should also say they are far too close together for social distancing, so we'll have to have words with the designers. But on the left there will be something about natural history, and we've got a huge cast of a fossil trackway. So we're bringing in the geology of the region as well as smaller objects. So it's going to be a really lovely space, but a really wide-ranging space. And once you're in this space on your whistle-stop tour of the museum, if you go straight ahead past space, you'll go out to the shop and to the exit. But if you turn left, you'll go into our temporary exhibition gallery. And if we have the next slide, it's got an image, just one image of one of the first things that will be on display in there. Because when we open, we'll have two displays in that new space, both done by students or former students, which felt to us like really the right way to launch this museum. So what this image is one of the photographs from a photographically illustrated edition of Alfred Tennyson's Idylls of the King, with the photographic illustrations and a lot of editorial work done by Julia Margaret Cameron, one of the real pioneers of photography in the middle of the 19th century. And our library special collections team acquired this book recently, and last year's Museum and Gallery Studies students did an exhibition for it, did all the marketing plan around it. We got to within 2 weeks of opening before we postponed the opening of the museum. So it's there, apart from one label. And it was sort of pretty devastating, I think, to the students and to us that it's not gone on display yet. So when we open, it will. But it's a great example of how the exhibition space isn't just a way of the public coming in and seeing the collections and research of the university. It's also really integrated into the teaching that we do in the university. So right next door to that is another student, former student, but this time one who's now quite established as an artist. And on the next slide, you can see a sneak preview of a new work by Philip Colbert that will be going into the museum. Now, those of you who've seen a lot of old master oil paintings might recognise the reference for this one. Philip studied philosophy at St Andrews, and he's talked a lot about how he was formed as an artist by his time here. He also developed this lobster alter ego who narrates his paintings and appears in a lot of them. And he has a really strong memory of being in an art history lecture at St Andrews and seeing an image of the painting of the death of Marat, showing the murder of Marat, the French revolutionary leader and thinker, in his bath. And so he's created this artwork, which is referencing that old master artwork, but bringing in a lot of themes from pop culture, which he's really inspired by, and lots of layers of understanding of both the image and himself as an artist. So it's really exciting, this work, but this is also only one of a whole suite of new works that he's done for the exhibition. So we're really looking forward to sharing these, and it's really exciting to have that kind of opening show that, again, is one of our former students. So if we can go to the next slide, I won't sort of dwell too much on this, but I thought I'd finish by talking a little bit about the future here, because I've given you a glimpse of the past. The present is we got to 2 weeks from opening this amazing museum and then had to postpone. I was looking back at my Facebook page and realised that in March, when we postponed the opening, I said something like, I've got a few more weeks to make outfits for the opening parties now. And that feels now very optimistic, but we are very close. We will be opening just as soon as we can. But meanwhile, what we've been doing is a lot of work on what we're going to be doing going forwards. We have very much the same enduring mission that we've always had, which is to do with taking care of and sharing the university's collections. And that's about engaging people everywhere with this distinctive and amazing place. For the museums, we have also got a vision around reimagination. We want to really embrace that spirit of inquiry that a university has. And so to be rooted in the history of the place, to really take strength from the long history of St Andrews, but to be innovative and to push forward and try things out, to work really collaboratively with staff and students, and to have conversations very widely about what place the museums can have. And if you think right back to where I started, the University Museum was founded through this unique partnership between the university and the town. And we want to be that today too. We want to be a social hub and a cultural hub that connects St Andrews communities with each other. At the moment, it's a rather strange time in St Andrews. It's very quiet, but we want the museum to be a really busy place, a really vibrant place where people have interesting conversations, see inspiring things, and get, you know, a different kind of experience than they can get elsewhere in the university or elsewhere in the town. So we are thinking about how and when to open. We're looking at all of that practical stuff around social distancing. We will keep you posted on when we can open. We're as keen as anybody to get the building open because we're really, really proud of what we've done and really excited to share it with you. Meanwhile, what we're doing is a lot of work to prepare the university and to prepare for teaching, particularly from September. We're doing a lot of digitisation so that people can see our collections and use our collections online, as well as coming to see them in the museum building. And you might have seen, if you've looked at our social media and our webpage, that we're doing a lot of digital outreach and engagement, so video and social media, And there's a lot more of that coming soon. So very much watch this space for more. And if you go to the last slide, really the most important thing is please do visit us soon, whether that's in St Andrews or online. We are excited about what we're doing with the museums, and we really look forward to sharing it all with you very soon. So we've got a bit of time now for questions. My colleague Caroline Wardlaw is going to join us and moderate the questions. I can see that we've got some queued up, but not what they are, but there's still time to contribute more if you would like to. So welcome, Caroline.
Hi, Katie, thanks so much for that. It was a really great talk. And thanks to everybody that's posted questions. There's some really interesting ones. But I think the first one I'd love to hear the answer to as well is from somebody wanting to know which items in the collection are you most excited to be able to include in the Wardlaw Museum?
That's a really tough question. It's a cliche, but it's like asking somebody to choose their favourite child or something. It changes every day. The more I look into the collection, I get really fascinated by one thing. We actually just had a vote in the museum's team today to try and choose our next group of feature objects to do online. And we couldn't come up with a shortlist very easily at all. I love objects that tell big stories. So it doesn't have to be a particularly flashy object. It can tell a really interesting story, a really compelling story. So what it is changes daily. Today I'm really fascinated by a mouth ornament that was collected from a small island near Papua New Guinea in 1837. And the reason I'm fascinated by that object isn't just that it's an amazing object that was very early donation to the collection. It's that thanks to connections through the social anthropology department and through a particular PhD student there, we've managed to get in touch with people living in that area and on that particular island today, who've given us more information about the object and its significance, and really helped us piece together the whole story of the object. So when it goes on display, it'll have our label saying what we know about it, alongside a label which gives the perspective from the people who know it better than we do. And so that's the one that I'm loving a lot today.
That's great, thank you. And another question sort of related to that. From such a wealth of artifacts available, Laura Gordon's asking, how do you go about making decisions as to which you might feature in a display, and how often do you plan to change the displays in the new building?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's tough. I mean, what we're always looking for is a really great idea at the heart of an exhibition. So I always say that a good exhibition you can sum up in a sentence or two, and you work from there. So we work with academics a lot, sometimes with students too. And so the ideas come from all over the place. Sometimes we start from an object and build an exhibition around a fascinating object, but more usually we have a conversation about a theme and sometimes connected to a research project. We have a whole process for people to propose ideas to us. So what we hope is that as this thing really gets moving, we will have more ideas than we can possibly feature in the building. And so we're looking at online content and other options to feature some of that. We have a process where we look at all the ideas that come in. Occasionally what we do is we see there's a gap in our sort of subject coverage, because we want to cover everything the university does, which means sometimes we spot a gap and we start going off and targeting a particular area. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment on a really exciting exhibition about oceanography, which is bringing in research from the Scottish Oceans Institute, but we're trying to use that as a way not just to help people understand what we know about the oceans and the research we're doing, but also to understand how they can take action in relation to climate change and to protect the oceans. And that's a good example of a project where we're really pushing to try and do something new with the museum. We're not totally sure what the objects are going to be, because we did look into having a coral tank with actual coral in it until we realised that was going to be really, really difficult to look after. But it's a really fun collaborative process, and that's one of the reasons I love working in a university museum. You get to work with really fascinating projects and people all across the university.
Thank you. And related to that idea of how you select what's in the museum, Betsy Ali is asking a very topical question. With all the attention in the museum field on the idea of returning colonial era museum objects, including ones that may be ethically questionable these days, could you share a little bit about how you're thinking about that and how it relates to the collections?
Yeah, it's something that we work on kind of constantly to understand where objects came from, how they came to be in the collection. And that understanding is really the first stage to working out what to do with the collection. The thing that I found really fascinating is that we are unusual in having such good records. So we have work to do to go through all of those records. But like with the mouth ornament that I mentioned, sometimes the more you look into it, the more fascinating and interesting it becomes. We haven't yet got to the stage of working out where this goes with particular objects. We will obviously look at any that come up which have particularly problematic context. But at the moment, we're working through all our documents and really putting them into the context of, how they were collected, what they are, what they meant in St Andrews when they were collected, what they mean in St Andrews now, and digitizing and sharing it all so that it's accessible anywhere.
And so connected to that, Ian Johnson's asking about whether there are any items in the collection that could be regarded as tainted by slavery, slave trade, or colonialist links. And how are you going to handle that?
The collecting context in the 19th century, it almost inevitably is connected to imperial and colonial contexts. There's a lot of connections between St Andrews and the East India Company. There's a lot of connections between St Andrews and missionaries who went out all over the world to try and convert people, sometimes connected with empire, sometimes as part of a Christian mission less strongly connected with empire. So we are looking at all of that. It's one of the aspects of the collection here that hasn't really been looked at previously, and it's something we were determined to look into properly and to contextualize more richly and more appropriately, because that is part of the history of St Andrews. It is part of how this place was and how it grew in the 19th century. So we are looking really actively at that, and in the new museum we're putting some of that context around those objects and presenting that, and we're saying that this is a work in progress, and that is the case for all museums at the moment. Absolutely, thank you.
Thinking a bit more about the audience for the museum, we have an anonymous question just asking out of curiosity, how many of today's audience are students or graduates of the university? And I suppose the other side of that is what proportion of visitors come from tourism and the local area?
Yeah, that's actually a surprisingly tricky question, because before we closed, it was around about 35,000 visitors a year for just Noosa, around about 50,000 in total across the different sites. But what we don't know is when we reopen how that might change. So we've got some information on students and tourists, but we haven't got a very good breakdown. We're doing a lot of work on that at the moment. We have some guesswork as to what we think it will be. We have a sort of running bet between me and my boss about what the visitor numbers will actually be. But we're hoping to expand the visitors a lot, to have more people visiting. And we hope really to be at the heart of the life of the university. So we want more students to come and visit. We want it to be really actively a space that staff and students feel like is their museum. But at the moment, we're going to have to wait and see. I mean, the current crisis period has thrown all of our estimates into question. We don't really know how fast tourism will return to Scotland. Probably that's next year rather than this year. So we're just working on all of this, but it's something we're thinking quite deeply about, obviously, as we think about our exhibition programme, because we know in the summer there's more tourists in St Andrews, whereas in the winter it's much more students and staff and their families. So we're working that through as we think about the exhibitions programme as well, but we're going to have to some degree, wait and see.
Sounds good. And connected with that, Craig Rutherford is asking, could you tell us a bit more about how the museum will interact with students, and are there specific courses which students can undertake, and will students have the chance to influence what is on in the museum?
Yes, the museum has established a student advisory panel, which is up and running, and they see all exhibition programme proposals and they feed into us on those, and that's already had a really clear impact, because there was one proposed exhibition that we thought was interesting but we weren't sure about, and we put that to the students and they just said, nah, this is terrible, don't put this on. They were wonderfully frank, and it really helped us with something we we weren't that excited about, but they were so clear. We're like, okay, that's feedback we need. And so we really value that input and that honesty and that challenge, because that's part of how we want to work. We want to be a place that where everything we do is buy-in with staff and students. So they're built into our early stage programming decisions. In terms of teaching, we're working obviously very actively with museum and gallery studies. We're also using the collections with several different courses. The classics school use the collections very actively. There's some of the history professors use the collections very actively, and we're expanding that all the time, because the more we make our collection available and digitize it, the easier it is for people to use it, especially now we're teaching online.
That's great, fantastic to hear. And somebody else is asking what methods and processes are in place, and how will the university and sector ensure diversity within both your audience and your workforce?
Yeah, we're putting in place all our evaluation plans at the moment to track that, because we haven't always in the past had very clear figures for museum visitors. The university's got much better figures for staff and students. And there's work to do. The staff of the university are less diverse than its student body, and we all acknowledge that there's work to do there. For visitors to the museum, again, we're going to put measures in place to track that and make sure that we're doing everything we can. We're partly bringing that into some of our programming decisions, but we're also actively working to build the collection. So there are some areas of the collection that are weaker, that we haven't got as many objects or artworks or whatever. So we're actively acquiring things to balance that out, to extend what we can do. So last year we acquired a really amazing set of photographs by a Scottish photographer, Maud Salter. And her work was all about, as she put it, putting Black women back in the frame. And by that she meant not just in the image, but in collections. And we acquired a series called Significant Others, which is about the relationship of people and families and personal lives and public lives and history. And it connects to a lot of the events of the second half of the 20th century. And we're going to be hanging that photographic series around the university buildings, well, when we get back in, sometime soon, we hope. And that's the kind of thing we're doing as well, is so that whatever we do that's around diversifying our staff and our audience is built on also changing what's underneath, so that it's not just an add-on.
And somebody else is asking whether you have any thoughts about exhibitions chosen by guest curators.
Yes, I mean, you can think of in a way, our academic co-curators as guest curators. They mostly haven't done an exhibition before when they work with us, and so we very much work in partnership with them. We have a process for anybody who'd like to propose an exhibition to us. And on our website, actually, there's a little form called the Note of Interest form, where we encourage people to put an idea to us before it's even really fully formed, because we find that helps not kill the good ideas early. You know, if you hit people with a huge form, sometimes a really good idea can just sort of never quite get written down. So we've really set the process up to help people bring ideas forward, perhaps especially if they don't know what it might turn out like, or if they're not sure, they've not done it before, whatever. So we really welcome that.
That's great. Alex is asking, what do you think visitors will feel are the most striking changes following the reopening, both in terms of the physical spaces and the curatorial approach?
I think, well, what I certainly hope is that people will walk in and just go, wow, and then pause a moment, because when you walk in, it'll be a new entrance area, which will be a much more kind of special welcome. And then as you go into the galleries, you saw from the visualizations, we're using really rich colours and really changing the approach to being much more of a sort of an experience that takes you into the university in its spirit and in some of what it does, as well as showing kind of amazing objects. So there's fewer objects than there was, there's fewer words than there were, but we've been really careful to make sure there's just enough in the way of labels and panels and supporting material to tell the story that we want to tell, to really bring people into what the university does and how it does it, and the kind of distinctive way this is. It's not like other universities, right? People said that to me before I moved here, and I thought every university says that. And then I came here and realized it's really true. This is an unusual and distinctive place. So we want to really bring people into that.
That's fantastic. A couple of more practical questions about when the building may be able to open again, and will there be a charge for entrance? One is probably easier to answer than the other.
Well, there won't be a charge for entrance. The part of the principle of this is that it'll be free entry, and that we want people to feel like it's their space to come to over and over again. When it'll open is more complicated, because we were 2 weeks away from opening before the lockdown started. But it's obviously a much more complicated thing to finish a project that's running than it is to restart a project that's paused. So I want to be open as soon as we can, but the university is really prioritising, and I think rightly prioritising, the experience of our students next semester. And we have to get that right. If the museum can be part of that, that's brilliant, but actually we've got complications to work out around getting all our contractors back on site. And you know, when it takes 2 people to lift an object and put it onto a mount on the wall, how do you do that socially distanced? And if you can't, what do you have to put in place to make that safe? We also want our visitors to feel really confident about visiting. There was a survey that just came out today saying only about a quarter of cultural audience in Scotland will be straight through the doors of museums when they can. I'm one of that 25%, but we also want to make sure the museum feels like a really wonderful and safe space to visit for people who might be in the slightly more nervous 3/4 of that group. So we're working on all those plans at the moment, and yeah, as soon as I know, I'll be the first to tell everybody. My background picture is the view from the terrace at the museum, but don't be fooled, I'm not allowed in there at the moment either. So.
And similarly, my picture is that I'm out at the front of the building and I'm not. So well, we can all hope that we'll be back there soon. Somebody else is asking whether you'll be needing volunteers to help run the museum when it opens.
We absolutely welcome volunteers. We've got new volunteer programs that we're just putting the details around at the moment. The way we tend to think about them is there's a whole range of ways to support the museum. That can be, you know, a few minutes engaging with us online, you know, retweeting something we've tweeted at kind of one end of the scale. That's a way of helping us, all the way through to a program we're developing for students, which we're calling skill builder volunteering. So they'll be with us over a year and work on projects and really build skills that help their employability. So we'll publish more of that when we've got it worked through a bit more on our website. But yeah, we want it to be a space where people really, you know, enjoy visiting, but also enjoy being part of the museum.
And connected to that, Pamela's asking how important is philanthropy in the success of the museum, and what impact will it have in the future?
It's been hugely important. I mean, taking philanthropy very, very broadly as all the different ways people support the museum and the university more broadly, philanthropy has been what's brought in the majority of the money to help the museum project happen. It's also what built the collection in large part. It's impossible to sort of overstate the importance of it. We hope also that the museum provides a space that really showcases the best of what the university can do and encourages people to support the university more broadly. So yeah, it's only been possible by lots and lots of people helping make it possible. So there'll be a lot of celebration when we open. So thank you.
Well, we're nearing the end of our allotted time, but I just wanted to share one more comment from Elaine Cartwright, who was saying she just wanted to share that she thinks it's great that you've been providing online activities for children during the lockdown. It's good to include all ages in your outreach programme and to introduce children to museums from a young age. Do you have plans for the reopening that will include the children's programme, which was so successful previously as well?
Yeah, it is really amazing the way those kind of under fives just become comfortable in a museum environment when you have a structured programme. And we want to continue to do that. We have some challenges around how you do that when we first open, but we're going to continue our online programmes while the museum building is restricted. But we've been really delighted with the response to those online sessions. And I have to say all credit to the learning team, because at the point when we started that online programme, I was still preoccupied with, are all the buildings locked? Are all the staff safe? What's happened? We're just locked down, the world is crazy. And the learning team quietly went away and formed this whole programme and launched it within about 2 weeks. And it's a really amazing example of the way people have adapted to the current crisis, but always kept that core of what we are. we are there for the people of this area. We're there to support staff and students through this crisis. So we've also done things around well-being and tried to really focus our online activity in those areas. And it was just really amazing for me as the director. I got this email saying, can we do this? And I looked at it and was like, of course, it's amazing. So that's what I love about working in museums. You have, the ability to take an idea like that and run with it and do something that contributes positively.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie. I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time with you this evening, but it's been great to hear your thoughts on the collections and your plans for the reopening. Now, Katie's very kindly offered to answer any remaining questions, and they will be posted alongside a recording of this talk, which will be on YouTube later this week, and there'll be a link to that in St Andrews in the News. But thank you so much, Katie, and I'm sure we'll all look forward to coming to the Wardlaw Museum when it is able to reopen. Thank you very much.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us.